Describe what your experience was. Where did you live? Where were you sent? What happened to you in these schools growing up?
I was in the boarding schools when punishment was very severe if you ran away. This was during the early 40s. I was taken to boarding school when I was 4 years old, taken away from my mother and my father, my grandparents, who I stayed with most of the time, and just abruptly taken away and then put into the boarding school 300 miles away from our home. And you know, the beatings began immediately. Almost the de-Indianizing program. It was a terrible experience that the American government was experimenting with, and that was trying to destroy the culture in the person, destroy the Indianness, and then save the human being, save them, kill an Indian, save the man. That was you know, the description of what this policy is about trying to...
Now, the government ran the schools?
The U.S. government paid, of course, they ran a lot of the schools themselves, but they also delegated a lot of it to the Christians, Christian communities. The Catholics had some, the Episcopalians had some, the Lutherans had some, Methodists had some, and so it was like a complicit. There is complicity between the churches and the state, and taking care of the Indian problem, solving the Indian problem, and trying to change.
Dennis, where had you lived? Where had you lived, and where were you brought to school?
I lived on the federal, on the Leech Lake Indian Reservation, where I was born, in northern Minnesota, and I was taken to a boarding school 300 miles away to the southernmost part of Minnesota, the southwestern part, called Pipestone Indian School. I stayed there 6 years. Go ahead.
How did you communicate with your family, and how often did you get to see them? Did you get to talk to them?
Never. Never. You know, they cut off all communication with your parents, and a lot of letters which I found later. I stayed there for 6 years without communicating with my parents at all, and finally they let us go home for 6 years. Of course, we couldn't speak the language. We couldn't speak only English and what these young people were talking about. But there was severe punishment for running away from that kind of system. I ran away. I kept running away. Almost once a week, I'd run away from those schools. They'd catch me. They'd bring me back to the school, beat me, and it was terrible. I mean, there was other kinds of punishment that we went through as well, and it was that kind of experience. I still remember what it is like today, and I have a friend who's been my friend for over 70 years now, and we remember those days. We stuck together. A lot of people stuck together and just being together. That's what saved a lot of us from terrible consequences of speaking. But eventually, they kept beating me down, and I started learning English, and I started learning who the presidents were. I started learning all that stuff, and then they let me go home for 30 days, 6 years. And I asked my mother, I said, "Why didn't you write to me?" And she, and she says, "I did, but I never questioned beyond that." And then they sent me to another boarding school in North Dakota, another 200 miles away. I was there for 3 years, and then after that, same thing. No, only English. Corporal punishment. And then I went home for another 30 days. Asked my mother, "Why is it you didn't write to me again?" She says, "I did. Then I did." Then they sent me to another boarding school in South Dakota, further away. So another 400 miles. I kept running away from these schools, and I finally ran away from the last one, and I finally made it home. And so I wanted to say, Amy, that this not only happened to people in North Dakota and South Dakota and Minnesota, but all across the country, thousands upon thousands of young students, Native students, were taken from their homes, and some were forcibly taken, some because of economic times allowed that to happen, but it was always taking them away from the parent, separate them from the parents for long periods of time, and what they did with me, and all of a sudden I lost my family relationship with my mother. I lost that feeling with my mother, and because I thought she abandoned me. And it wasn't until almost just 3 years ago when my daughter they were doing a documentary on Dennis Banks, and they went to in the Federal Depository Records in Kansas City, and she called me and she said, Dad, she said, we found your school records. And I said, bring them back. So she brought them back, and I started looking at them, and she says, Dad, we also found something else. She handed me a shoebox, and I opened up the shoebox, and those were letters from my mother. And I started opening them up, and I started reading them. And then the second one, there was a letter to the superintendent of the school. It said, here's $5, please send my children, my son back home to me. And I couldn't finish reading these letters because I was just tearing up, and so I went to the graveside. My mother had passed away. When she did pass away, I went to bury her, but there was no emotions with me. And then going there this time with the letters, and I was reading the letters, I had a chair sitting right by her grave, and I started reading these letters. And I knew that she loved me then. I mean, even now, even at this moment, I feel that man, it's a hard experience to tell people, but I tell them anyway. I tell what happened, because it was a terrible experience, but it failed miserably. I mean, but even today, I know some of the language. I don't know all the language. I know a lot of songs which came back to me, but the language, it seemed like you want to say something, and you remember the beatings and stuff like that, and so, but it was terrible.